Last year at AMP, we had a bit more of like a post-production theme, and we had this really kind of super heady post-production panel. This year, I wanted to put a strong focus on composers and composition, because we always have the element of the bands and original tracks and source music and licensing. That's always a part of this in the live performance stuff. But I'd like to continue this sort of theme of working with composers. So we didn't do this last year. We did have a couple composers sort of throughout, but I thought it would be interesting. I hope it's going to be really interesting for everyone to have an entire panel of composers to talk about their work and maybe demystify some things and provide some insight and anecdotal stories and tips of the trade. So I've had a lot of conversations with this gentleman over the past while, so I'm really happy that Hal Beckett's here to lead the conversation. I'm going to pass it over to him.
Thanks a lot, and thank you for all your efforts for music with VIFF. Appreciate it very much. Hi, everybody. Why don't we simply start with everybody gets 30 seconds. Raj, what do you do?
Check. Yeah, I write music for a lot of visual media. I do some film composing and also for games and a lot of Japanese anime. Any anime fans out there? There's a lot of Japanese anime, and some of my bigger stuff are Cowboy Bebop and Ghost in the Shell and some stuff like that. So I've been more in the Asian world of composition, but I'm starting to do a lot of work here in North America for different companies, documentaries, and Indian-esque sort of features and TV shows.
Great. John?
Hey, I'm John Morgan. I started out in the 90s playing keyboards in heavy metal bands, and I ended up at EA when it was easier to get a job there, and I did music, so there was a bunch of in-house composers at that time we didn't license, and I started making video game music in the 90s for EA Sports, and just stayed with it. I've been in games for 25 years. I am now the audio director at Microsoft Games, and do a lot of licensing and working with composers and various things like that, so for video games. So.
Great.
Hi, I'm Matthew Rogers. I'm a local composer for film and TV, and I love my job. And I also play in a band called The Harpoonist and the Axe Murderer. Yeah.
Which one are you?
I'm the Axe Murderer. Yeah. So I play the axe. Get it?
Of course.
He's really cool. You're really nice. I'm Red Heartbreaker. I'm a film composer for film and television, and I'm also a performer and voice coach, primarily for actors, for singing, for actors who get that update saying, okay, so your role is going to be a singer in 2 weeks. And I'm like, okay, let's see what you got. And they're like, we don't know what to do. And I go, okay, it's going to be fine. So I do that too. But I'm primarily a film composer, and I am really excited to be here.
Thank you. Brent.
Hi, I'm Brent Belke. I'm a composer for film and television based in East Vancouver. I guess my passion and love of music started with punk rock when I was a teenager, and I did that for many years and kind of fell into the film music thing because I loved film and I loved music, and it seemed like a logical progression. So I went to music school and learned what an English horn was, and I've been doing this for about 20 years now, I guess, just working in town, doing film and television.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. We had an idea of taking a quick poll right here. How many filmmakers in the room? Okay, and how many composers? Okay, good. Good to know. So, one of the things that I thought that we should be talking about is, the creative process. One of the things that I always deal with every project that I score is pacing and tempo. And, one of the first things that I do when I'm looking at a scene in a film is I will try to figure out what the best tempo or pulse of the scene is. And one short anecdote before I hand it off to the panel, an indie film, a great indie film I just finished called In God I Trust. I remember one scene in particular, I ended up doing 3 rewrites on it. Not because I'm a lousy composer, well, maybe it was because I was a lousy composer, but because the director, every cue I would give her, she would say, oh, yeah, it sounds great, it's the right kind of thing, but it's just moving too fast. Can we take the tempo down? And I think the 3rd iteration, I was going about 40 beats per minute. It was just so slow, like the harmonic pulse of the scene now was very, very slow, and she loved it. And so I probably started at, let's say, 68 beats per minute, then went down to maybe 58 or 54 beats per minute, and then ended up around 40, and that was the pace she wanted. And, in retrospect, I look at it now and go, yeah, she was absolutely right. So have you run into this kind of, not maybe as overt as my example, but how do you deal with, harmonic pacing, pulse subdivisions, all these kinds of things? We were talking about pulse subdivisions the other night. How do you deal with that kind of stuff, Raj?
I personally try to find references that I can present back to the client and see what works for them, because they often can't communicate what's in their mind, what they want. And so instead of letting them give me temp music, I try to give them reference music that they can choose from if they have some ideas, and then it makes them hone in on what they want more specifically and go, I like this piece or this cue, this type of cue, and then that gives me a lot of information to work with. Instead of trying to guess what they want, I can sort of go off the reference that they've given me.
Well, that's interesting. I'll hand that over to you, John, because you just said one of the words that I wanted to talk about today too, and you mentioned temp music. So I don't know if that's a subject you want to embrace right now.
Sure. So temp music is super important, and I think most executive producers, game designers have a cultural reference of what their temp music would be. So I think the last panel, one of the really good takeaways I got was like hang out with your directors and composers and just try to get inside their heads. So temp music, once as a composer, once you're inside their heads, as their as far as their cultural references go, then you might have a better idea what temp music they might be looking for if they didn't supply that. And then at that point, temping up the scene, or in our case, the gameplay section or something like that, or a cinematic with temp music really, really helps. It's one of the first things we do. And then, you want to get the most of your composer by going, don't write in the mood. Obviously, don't rip this off because we want something original. We don't want, to affect you, but, temp music at an early stage of the project is super important.
Well, we can talk about plagiarism later on.
Yeah.
One question I'll just to keep with you for a second, because you're in a position where you've got other composers working with you, so you're getting submissions from them. Composers have been listening to the temp that's been cut in. The whole team's going, yeah, this is the right vibe, and now the composer's got to give you something that's in a similar style. How have you ever had trouble sort of reconciling with the new music coming in from the composer against this temp music that's now the team's been living with for a couple of months, sort of thing?
Yeah, occasionally, like lately, the composers I've been working with, we sometimes don't even show them the temp music anymore, even though we know about it. We just use it to give them verbal cues or written sort of cues as to what we want. Some of them don't want it. Ramin's exactly like that. Working with Ramin, he doesn't want to hear the temp music because he's worried about it influencing him that way. So yeah, so that's something we
don't need to stay on the temp music subject, Matt. But what thoughts did you have about things like pacing and how you approach a scene from a pacing standpoint?
Yeah, one thing that I actually love to do is, have the temp inform you somewhat, but then watch the scene completely dry. And I actually will get out a little pocket recorder and vocalize what I think the music should be, so that it's completely instinctual, and it's actually me just going boom, chaka, taka, taka, or whatever. But it's then the music is living in my imagination. I'm not so tied to, a piano or a DAW. I'm going completely off of instinct, and yeah, that's a way that I like to start in terms of finding the right pulse and tempo, as you say.
Red.
I love this question. I think that there is, I'm going to kind of do a sidestep and then answer the question. I think there is a thing about writing in one art form for another art form, which means that you have a lot of different layers that you're, if you're thinking of the director or the producer, depending on who your decision maker is, as the client or your decision maker, there are so many layers in which they're going to have emotional connection that they either want you to know about or they want the audience to feel, And so I think we have to remember that our job is to be the one who's best at the music, but then to be also the best at translating. And I think that, we all see music through our own lens, through our own life experiences and stuff like that. And so working with a director or somebody that you haven't worked with before, and maybe you don't have that shorthand with them, maybe you don't have that sort of like common language about music, you can end up with some really wild things if you don't look at the temp and look at, where they feel the energy is coming from. So do they feel like the energy is coming from just a really driving, pulsing rhythm in the kick drum, or are they feeling like they want to feel little ghost rhythms in, a harpsichord or something like that? Where are they feeling that energy from? So if I could just never listen to temp ever again, I would, but that is an ego move where I think that I know better than everybody else all the time. And the reality is that if the director has a piece of temp music that they feel is capturing the energy, I can harvest that from my discussions with them from a really solid spotting session. Like, I don't think I've ever had a spotting session that was less than 3 hours, ever. I do my initial brainstorm with the director, and I'm like, you're just gonna have to get a really long parking pass for today, because this is what you're doing. Because if you want me to write awesome music for your movie, I really need to like absolutely suck your brain dry before I get started. And then you're not welcome in my space for the next little bit. Just like, fuck off and let me work. So to answer the question, where I get tempo and key area comes from every level of filmmaking, because I've been a composer for a good long time, but also like my community is filmmakers. And so I've been doing craft services and like gripping and like coiling cables on movies just as long as I've been composing. And I've been a professional musician for 30 years and a classical musician for over 20 years and a film composer for 12. So like there's so many different layers that we come to what we're doing on. So my job is to find out which layers of information are appropriate for the project and for the filmmaker that I'm working with. So for me, if they are struggling to explain what they want and they don't have meaningful temp for that scene, then my job is to find common language and say, okay, are you feeling like the speed of the edits? Your editor probably cut it to temp music for their own purposes so that it feels like there's a pulse in the scene. Do you want me to take the pulse from this scene? This tempo, does that feel right to you? This sound, your color correction hasn't been done yet, but I know in this palette you're going with a lot of blues and oranges and stuff like that, and this is gonna be a really beautiful, warm scene, and the cuts are long, which means that theoretically the music should be in these long phases unless you're trying to put that unconscious pacing on its head, right? So understanding how the director, how the decision maker, whoever the decision maker is, sees energy, sees emotion, feels that satisfying full sound, or wants to turn it on their head and say, all I want is like wicked Oort cloud like off in the surrounds, and then I want like one wicked shitty frequency that makes you feel like you've got tinnitus, and that's all I want for the score. Your job is to harvest that from them and then to figure out where your boundaries are in terms of the temp, because it can be helpful, but if you can avoid using it and create something unique, I think you always end up with a better product.
Great answer. For me, one of the things I do in a spotting session is, and I must drive the director and producers nuts because I say the same thing, is this temp working for you? Is this temp working for you? And the second they say no or turn it off, please, because it's like, why is it in there if it's not working for you? It's just a placeholder kind of thing. What do you have to say about that?
We're talking about temp music, aren't we?
Well, we are now, but you don't have to. Let's go back to pacing.
He's been talking about this for like 3
Pacing's
days.
a better subject than a bunch of composers bitching about, temp music.
I'm still fixated on that 40 beats per minute.
Yeah.
So slow.
I don't think I've ever written anything at 40 beats per minute. But starting with the tempo, the challenge of what we do, or any artist, like staring at the blank page, can be daunting, right? So, I guess the paramount thing for writing music is getting the proper emotion for the scene. But still, we got to start with, when you're sitting down at your machine, you got to set the tempo at something, right? Yeah, and as far as, I like what Matt said about just do a vocal thing. But I'll watch the scene and I'll have a keyboard and you want to hit certain things, and then I'll just hit the keyboard and then I'll just create a region, and I write stuff. I have like 2 tracks of no output, and I'll have, happy, sad, hit that blink or whatever. So I'll just watch through, and that'll sort of help set the tempo. And depending if it's like a sparse piece, I'll just put like some kind of loop in that will inspire me, and then you can just, with the magic of a computer, just set the tempo, because the tempo, the emotion's the most important thing, but the tempo with the film is gonna pace it and everything, and that is so important to get the tempo. I've worked on stuff and it's just not quite working. You've spent hours and it's just not working, and then you just kind of tweak the tempo and you go, oh shit, now it's working, right? The tempo is so important, right?
I think also from a technical perspective, the tempo is so crucial, particularly in movies where the music is either contiguous or there's not a lot of time between scenes, or if the locked cut is maybe not...
The latched cut?
The latch cut, yeah. It's the last, final, absolute last, final 2.0, final 2.1. Locked this, no, for real, it's locked. So like when they're all contiguous, the second you start messing with tempo, you are stretching or expanding the length of your region. So it's just a really basic technical thing. But if you've got, music that is really tightly tied to edits, when you start changing your tempo, you go, okay, I don't have enough time for this chord progression now. So I need to rethink how I get from 1 to 5, to 2 to 6 to 5 to 1. How do I do that? And so that
leads nicely into my next subject.
You're welcome.
And I called it harmonic ambiguity. Now, we're talking musical terms here, but we're a bunch of composers. So, if you thought this was a panel about how to get into the biz, you're in the wrong place. But harmonic ambiguity, I talk about that because we've all had to deal with this issue. It's like, okay, what's the basic? Major chord, happy, minor chord, sad. Okay, we all get that. But it's like, then now, if we don't want it to be either overtly those 2 emotions, how do we deal with that? So we start looking at things like, okay, well, let's play a 2 chord, or let's play a sus4 chord, or let's play a 7th with a sus, or that's sort of leaning into chordal harmony now. Oh, well, let's try something in quintal harmony, or let's try something that's really, truly atonal and see where we can go with that. The thing is, unless you've got a quite forward-thinking director, you can't go too far afield, because if it starts not sounding like a film score, unless it's a very quirky indie film, you're going into other areas. It's like, a director, and I'm sure every composer's had a director say this to us, I want to hear something I've never heard before. Okay, well, we all would like that, but and I've said to one, director who I was friendly with, it's like, well, if I wrote something that you'd never heard before, you'd hate it, because it would be quite atonal, it would be quite, different, it would have odd instrument combinations that you'd never heard before, and it wouldn't necessarily work with your film. But anyway, back to harmonic ambiguity. Is this something you want to tackle, Raj?
Not really.
Okay. Well, maybe it's too composery. I don't know of a subject.
One of my favorite notes that I've received multiple times is more neutral.
Yeah.
And it sounds kind of funny for a note to say be more neutral, but it happens. And I mean, I think the answer is fourths and fifths.
Well, true. I mean, I found that taking thirds out will definitely help with the neutrality of something, if that's what you want.
And also, an open fifth is just the backbone of your key. So it feels really satisfying to just hang out on an open fifth and then octaves and then fifth and octaves, and you don't have to make that decision to be ambiguous. But
Yeah,
Or then you go to a sharp 5 and then a 6, and all of a sudden you're in James Bond territory, right? You guys know what we're talking about? Most of you? Okay, I hope.
But the open fifth, that's a power chord on a guitar. So
exactly.
Yeah, we're talking AC/DC now.
Yeah.
yeah.
And the open fifth is also, it's a fifth, but it's also a fourth. You know what I mean? Like from 1 to 5 is a fifth, but from 5 to 1 is a fourth. You see what I did there?
John has some words of wisdom.
He's like, God, stop, please.
Yeah, like the chords I think are like it's the emotion to me. Like it's the music. Like, is this a dark? What are you writing? Like, and so I think the chords always come back to the base of what your intent is emotionally, and so you do get that a lot from like producers, like dumb it down or that's less, less notes. I've heard that before. And, a lot of scores like that are really popular now. Like Clinton Shorter, who's Vancouver composers, that's what he's all about. I mean, it's just ambience and drones and chords and and drums. And so you get that a lot now where, because they're so used to hearing that in film, even like Hans with the new Blade Runner score, it's very chordy and there's a lot of music there, but it's not notes. It's just tonal. And so that's kind of a lot of what I'm getting people wanting now. And so it is about the chords. And then if you break it all back down to what that is trying to say, you're backing right out to the very basis of what the emotion of the film is. So it's just kind
Well,
of
I mean, you say that it's, for instance, you mentioned Clint scores in Blade Runner, and it's, a lot of drones, ambiances. But I'm going to hazard a guess that most of the ambiances that you will hear in an ambient score, they do have a tonic, or they do have what we call in music a pedal. Which is a note, which is a key center. Now, even though there may not be other chords in a diatonic harmonic series relating back to that key center, you still have this grounded sense of that one note. And whether or not where I want to lead on this is this whole concept of tension and release. In standard music harmony, you've got a 5-1, which is 5 chord is tension, and a 1 chord is the release. And to emotion in music, let's think for a minute, what melodic things can we think of that have emotion to it, and how does that work? And in my book, how that works is a tension note now resolving, and that tension is what's giving you this kind of drive and emotion, and then the resolution is the satisfaction of that. And any good melodic writing, I mean, I'm a John Williams fan, so any good melodic writing involves this tension and release.
Can I grab that? I think there's a really interesting cultural thing at play with that sometimes people are aware of and sometimes they aren't, and I would assume that we're all kind of aware of what that is, so we can play with it or turn it on its head depending on what we want to accomplish from the score. Especially in what we think of as film music, so much of it is based strongly on a Western model of music, right? It's basically a colonial model of music. So everything is about, tempered pitch. It's about A440. Even, putting your scores into A432. If you guys, this is getting really nerdy now,
Maybe
but
you should tell them what the tempered scale is. And,
yeah,
as opposed to
so like
non-tempered.
absolute pitch isn't exactly the same. So when you have an A over here, and an A over here and an A over here, the space between them isn't exactly the same. It's a little bit off. And so for people who are born with perfect pitch, it's like 1 in 10,000 people is born with perfect pitch. They don't hear what you hear on the keyboard. They hear that the notes after a certain point are very slightly out of tune, either high or low. And so what we've done in Western music is we've decided, no, we need an algorithm that just levels all pitch out. So the idea is like, is A a little tiny bit higher than the average person hears it, or is it a little tiny bit lower? And so some people believe that you should change that. But what
to interrupt you with this thought for a minute, if you were going to get into, I don't think we're going to get into something so esoteric, but if you get into a non-tempered score or a non-Western pitch class of music,
Yeah.
now you're into something that's really specific for a very specific style of filmmaking.
Possibly, but where I'm getting to with this is that our concept of tonality is based on a westernized scale. We don't think about quarter tones, for example. Like you hear a quarter tone in music and we just say that is out of tune. And even for the average listener who is watching a sort of Western-based tonality is still very consonant. Like even trying, like you and I had an awesome conversation about how much we love major seconds and minor seconds. I want to sit on a minor second and a major seventh all day long is what I want to do. I just think that there's so much interesting tension in that, right? The thing, for example, Jaws. Or
Psycho.
Thank you. God damn, just not right? Those are minor seconds. You don't have to know what the movie is. You don't have to know what's happening in the scene to know that when you hear two notes right next to each other in that specific key range, clustered together, hit a whole bunch of times, somebody's getting fucking stabbed. That's what's happening. But we know that because Western music is baked in. Like we're baked in, and so the average person doesn't know that what they want is tonal or atonal if they don't have a musical background. And so what people are expecting to hear, and this is what I think is interesting about atonal music, or like the conversation about tonality, I think people are widening their horizons. And so I think for those of us that come up through a classical music background, the way you compose is really set. You have your basso continuo, you sketch out your melody, and then you fill in the chord. That's like core voice leading technique, except that people aren't doing that anymore. And so if you want to work, you have to adapt. So if a drone with those beautiful overtones gives you that feeling of home, the average listener doesn't know that what they're listening to is a major scale or an open fifth. They just know this feels like home. And the emotional part of that, our job is to know the technical side of it. But like, does this beautiful, low, warm drone that feeds off into major thirds and fourths and then goes right back to one? They don't know why. If what you did was you just picked the perfect tone and you just hit one button for 20 minutes, and that's just what that part of the score does.
Don't tell people we can do that.
I know. Damn you, Spitfire. It's too good. It's too good. Anyway, I've taken enough time. But I'd love to know from like different composition traditions. Hal, I'm stealing your job. From different composition traditions. Like I'm looking at you, Raj, because we were talking yesterday about the convergence about different kind of cultures.
I was just saying that for a lot of Indian music is a non-tempered scale. So I mean, there's a lot of notes that Western people consider like wrong, right? But in Indian music, it's totally acceptable and it's meant to be there.
22 pitches in Indian music?
I believe so, yeah. And then there's also the harmonic overtones that are happening when you hear sitar playing or any open-tuned instrument, tambura or anything in the background too. And then tablas are also tuned, right, to pitch too. So there's a lot of a melody going on in Indian music, including the harmonic overtones that are happening, and the movement. But the movement's different than Western classical orchestral music. And I think that it's weird that people, not weird, but it's the traditional accepted model is the orchestral model, and this is how it's supposed to be. And then, but nowadays, you're seeing a lot of people trying all sorts of new ideas that are not based on that orchestral model of music. That's really cool and interesting. And I just had a friend of mine call me, Will Roger, you probably know him. He's a pretty big game composer in the US, one of the biggest. And he called me up and he wanted to know about Indian music and how to use Indian music in his new game scores. And I think he not only the instrumentation, but the ideas behind Indian music and what he said that he's felt that he's used the orchestral model too often, and he wanted to have something new to put into his sort of bag of tricks to come up with something new. So, and I think that if you listen to Blade Runner, the Flying Lotus tracks, which are super interesting, progressive jazz with a ton of dissonance going on, is very interesting too. So we're seeing a new breed of composers coming out who are not Western trained, but yeah, more world music or progressive electronic, right? So.
Well, that's great. So you've touched on what is changing for us. One of the things I wanted
nothing,
to talk
right?
about, no, but it's like what is changing for us in this world of music, and if things are moving away from orchestral scores on
Yeah.
certain kinds of movies.
Not moving away, but just broadening.
I'm doing a
right?
romantic comedy. It's not really a romantic comedy, a romantic drama right now, and an orchestral palette is expected for that. Well, of course, with guitars and a little bit of electronica and stuff like that. But I mean, it's a traditional score, and that's what expected. If I did a quarter tonal, Indian raga score and handed that in on this romantic drama, they go, "What the hell are you doing?"
I would want to listen to that
Not
very,
in
very
India.
badly.
That'd go over real well in India. It's like
You call us up, we open a bottle of wine, and you play that shit. And we find that'd be awesome.
So what is changing now? Do we want to get into I'm going to mispronounce it, cultural approbation?
Appropriation.
Approbation. What does that mean? Appropriation. I mean, people talk about that, and I didn't even mean to touch this subject tonight or this afternoon, but I mean, is it appropriation in the panel's opinion when one mines, let's say, a sitar raga in a non-Indian specific score? What do you think?
That's a very good question. It's like, can a white guy have dreadlocks? It's is that appropriation or is it
yes,
just?
but it doesn't look right.
Yeah, it's personal choice. But that's what I love. Different things coming together. Like Michael Dannon's been doing it for years, sourcing different world music and then
Life of Pi. He did.
Life of Pi, yeah, and mixing it with traditional Western strings like Ice Storm. He had the gamelan, like a Sundanese gamelan with strings, and I love that. I love mixing the different things. But then, is it appropriation? I guess depends on how it's done, and what's the intent of it, I guess.
Well, I'll go on record of saying I don't think it is.
Yeah.
Because I think that as artists, we mine whatever stimulates us and excites us. I mean, going back into the Western tradition, Debussy hearing the Gamelan Orchestra at whatever the year it was, 1903 World's Fair in Paris, and he heard gamelan for the first time in his life, and that's when he started to change his part of his harmonic thinking of how he was and how he wrote music.
Anyway. That comes down to intent, because if cultural appropriation, if nobody's allowed to do if everyone has to stay in their separate camps, we're just going to be living in a world where everyone has to be in their separate camps and live by their own set of rules. Otherwise, they're not going to be. They have to stay in those worlds, right? And
If it's authentic, then it's celebration, not appropriation. Correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
That's what. Yeah. And the intent. If you like Debussy, he was deeply inspired by this music, and he went and did his music, but he was inspired by that. So I think that's a great thing.
Let's switch gears for a second.
Look, I'd like to answer that if you don't mind.
You got a comment?
I have.
Excuse me.
No, it's good. I have feelings about many things. So I have a strong feeling about cultural appropriation, but I don't think that the solution to trying to cross-pollinate between things is, I think the solution is to silo. I think that there's a difference between appropriation and appreciation, but I also think that you have to check your privilege on that. I think you have to recognize where you're coming from. There are certain demographics, and myself chiefly among them, that we have always been brought up to believe that everything is for us, and it isn't always your turn, right? So it isn't always my turn to ape that cultural music. Sometimes my job is to say, you should absolutely not hire me for that. Your job is to say, this opportunity is actually for someone whose job it is to write this kind of sacred music. I have no problem stealing cultural properties from white people. I will fake mass from beginning to end. I don't care, that's fine. But I reserve the right, and I'm just going to give a shout out to Ari Wise and Matt Safran at Core Agency. They have absolutely had my back on this, and I really, really, really appreciate it. It's a really meaningful thing to do. I reserve the right to add a clause into my standard contracts saying that I reserve the right to decline to do any culturally appropriative music. We're selective about where we put that. Yeah, because, come on, we have the internet now. There are people who do this shit. I do a lot of really awesome things. I'm super good at my job. But also, there is no reason in the world for me to pretend to write Indigenous music or to pretend to write, very culturally sacred Japanese music. It's not mine to write.
I think we need to make a distinction between writing a piece of music that is supposed to be, let's say, an Indigenous piece of music,
Correct, yeah.
as opposed to being inspired from Indigenous music,
Correct.
And adding an element that may be lifted from that realm into our own personal music.
And this is where I was getting to, is that again, the listener doesn't always necessarily know why a feeling is being evoked. So I don't have to do a ripoff of something I heard at a powwow. I can choose instruments that belong in that world, and I can write in my own voice. I can use timbre to lead the audience to a thematic element without pretending to do battle cries in my studio with my white ass face, because that's not my business to do. And I reserve the right to walk away from work that asks me to do that. But it's not just about putting up a boundary, and again, it's not about siloing, it's about saying, that is absolutely the right thing for this project. I have someone for you. I got a list of 15 people. They are ready to go today. You have no reason to hire me for this thing. I mean, this is probably gonna get me in, Ari, I'm really sorry, I'm probably gonna get in trouble. Cut my pay, I don't care. Take $250, I'm sorry, I know. We're all composers here though, don't tell anyone. Take $200, take $300 from my rate, give it to someone who actually writes that music, license a piece of meaningful music from somebody who makes that, and then stop pestering me about this so that we get the best possible thing, and then I can just move on to the stuff that you actually hired me to write. You're not actually hiring my skill set for that, you just want all the stuff in one house. Right?
Or set up a collaboration, right?
Yeah.
Totally, exactly. Build a bridge instead of just saying no or yes, and then taking up a space that really should be reserved for somebody else.
Good stuff.
Thanks.
What about this trend, which is not a new trend, but it's still a trend we have to deal with all the time, and that is music either being unobtrusive in a score or overt in a score. And the trend certainly has been to tamp down the music constantly. It's been my experience, to make it less and less overt. Where do you think we're headed on that? Do you think there's any chance of music moments coming back into film? Matt, there you go.
I mean, I think if you create a well-done, awesome, dynamic score that is really good, people are going to want to turn it up. And if it's not about you, then it's not about you, and they can feel free to turn it down. And I have no problem with that. If, going to mix sessions, I feel like most of my notes are turn the music down a little bit, or can we sneak in here? I don't want people listening to what I'm doing. I want them watching the scene. But, when there's a montage, when I've done something that I think is pretty awesome, I might say, hey, can we bump that up a bit? And usually that's fine because I have done something pretty awesome and everyone's happy to do that. So I to be honest, I haven't noticed that trend, but especially, in music or films or shows that I'm watching on Netflix or whatever, let's say, I actually find that a lot of these shows, the music has some pretty awesome moments. I mean, it'll be behind the dialogue and certain moments, but then there'll just be like some awesome gripping piece that, might only happen once in a whole show, but that's pretty great that happens. So, I don't know, I guess I'm not sure that is happening, to be honest.
kind of depends on the kind of media, right? For games, the music is driving the media for sure. Kids are crazy about game scores. I mean, that's the soundtrack of their lives because they're listening to that one cue. I heard one of my interns at the studio. He'd listened to this one cue that somebody Nobuo Uematsu wrote 1,000 times. He played the game and then he had it on his YouTube in the background while he was doing other things. So they're literally listening to those cues, right? Like maybe 500 times, or it's not even unusual for them to hear the cues that often, right? Because
Yeah, like millions, really. But it's about setting the score early. Like my friend Rom DePrisco used to work at EA Canada, wrote the theme song for Fortnite, and he just happened on a bunch of jams that him and a friend of his did. And it was some just washy guitar stuff. He put some beats behind it, and now it's like every kid in America is humming this song. And it's but the reason why they do is because they set it up in the menu, and so they give the menu is quite often a good spot to set up some music. And at that point, you can establish your themes. And okay, here's your music moment. I mean, Rod Ferguson, one of my studio directors, he's very adamant about us having a point in the game early on in the first half hour of gameplay where you actually have a music break and you have like a 3 or 4 minute section where it's all about the music. A really good example, I don't know if anyone's played the new Destiny, it's got spots like that where you within 20 minutes in gameplay there was a section where you're running in a field with these wolves chasing you, and it's all about this orchestral score. The Kronos Quartet played and kicks in, and so it's a really good music moment where they establish the themes. And once you've established your themes and you give a music moment to the audience, from there on you can pretty much do anything. You can tone it back. You can have it go way down, just the drums or whatever you want, and you've established everything, so you can always come back to it as you need. So.
I think a really interesting thing about game music as well, and I've noticed this in the games that I play, is that you have control over your levels of different kinds of audio, which I think is fantastic. I don't know if are there many gamers in the house? You guys play video games? Okay. A couple of people. So when you go into your menu, you can decide how loud the music is. You can decide how loud the dialogue is and how loud the combat sound effects and stuff is. So you can set your EQ, which you can't do in a movie, which I think would be that would be super cool if especially for an older audience, if you're making, a documentary, something like that. Some
they
people
can do
hear,
that in the mix in a movie, in a dub.
but
But
the user has control of it. So this is user designed content, right? So people are really rabid about this music, and they also have the ability to tailor make that experience for their own tastes, which I think is a huge economic opportunity. I think it's a massive business opportunity. And as well, I think that music, I have a weekly D&D group. We sit around and play D&D, and I play with video game execs, basically. So people who are high level concept artists and lead writers for massive AAA content. And so what we do, and I know that we're not unique in this, we have easily 50 or 60 different playlists of video game music specifically, but it's these massive, beautiful, gothic compositions that are it's the 50th coming of the discovery of the symphony. It's just massive concept music. And we just switch playlists. We're okay, now we're gonna go and we're playing Shadowrun, so we're pretending to be in the 90s in the futuristic Beijing. So we're what do you listen to in an underground crime syndicate in Beijing? Oh, it's fucking this is what we're listening to, right? And so the plays, you can't argue with the metrics on it. Somebody listening to a song 1,000 times, think about the charting potential for that 1,000 times. Why are we not recording plays for this music that's looping onto, live content, the online RPGs? Why are we not counting plays for that?
Well, game music is
exactly.
Game music is so much like the pop songs we all grew up with. I mean, I was involved in the Zelda concerts that happened here in Vancouver, and one of the things that I wasn't prepared for at the concerts was watching the audience with the tears streaming down their face as they're listening to the Zelda music played by the orchestra, and I just looked at the reactions and just wow.
Well,
I wasn't ready for that.
And that's a good thing. Like in Japanese culture, music especially in games, is just so much more important. If you actually play Japanese-based video games, the music score is way louder and there's way more music. And in fact, the sound design is almost takes a massive backseat, whereas in North American culture and movies and games, we tend to like put the music back in the mix, and it's all about sound design or how cool it sounds, and they just look at it a different way because it's more of an emotional delivery that they're trying to give. So Zelda's a really good example of that. So.
Well, I don't know how much time we've got left, but there was another subject I wanted to touch on, which is dear to my heart, and that is, we all of us composers these days, we're all using our computers because this is what we have to do these days. We're all using computer samples. But let's talk about live music and what live music can bring to any production we do. Yes, I know there's a cost with live music, which is sometimes prohibitive in the kind of projects that we're working on. But Brent, do you want to start off with that, with computer samples versus live instruments, or the combination of such?
Oh, samples are just getting better and better and better and more believable all the time. In the last 5 years even. But at the same time, studio rental prices have dropped a lot too. So you can't forget that a live player is just going to take everything, elevate it. So I think the biggest problem with that is just the time constraint. If you got 3 weeks to write 60 minutes of music, if you're going to add a session at the end, that's like a day to prep it and get the copying, and a day.
Well, I was going to actually put in my notes to let's not talk about the practicalities, because there's that, and then the cost. Let's put those two issues, which are real issues, but let's put those two issues aside and just talk about the aesthetic value of, I've always felt that you've got, if I hire some live musicians, now I've got, whatever number, a bunch of musicians' brains now working on my music, and they're going to take it, and you use the word elevate, and that is correct. So
yes.
Continue on.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure. It's definitely going to elevate it. And, the last panel they were talking about collaborating, and I'm not a string player, but you get string players in, and they'll give you suggestions. Well, we could just do it this way instead, and we do it this way instead. Or did you think about doing this? And then you're gonna take it to places that you wouldn't have done it on your own. So definitely, even if you just get on the phone and talk to a viola player and get some pointers from them, but getting real players to play real music, it's gonna always be better, even though samples are getting very realistic and believable, but it's not quite the same, right?
I'm going to add two things to that. I think creating relationships with live players is extremely important. I know, for example, I've got a guy that I can actually just ship out a score to. He just looks at the MIDI notes, and I don't have to worry about charting it. He records it and sends me back these wonderful string sounds. And so getting to know people like that can do that perhaps in their own studio. I've used you to do that in your own studio, singing, and creating those relationships with other live musicians can be extremely valuable. And I also think learning to play as many instruments as you can yourself can really add a lot of not just production value, but uniqueness, so it doesn't just sound like you're, using the Spitfire, amazing Spitfire library.
Spitfire library. The alternative strings, I'm all about it right now. There's the most beautiful viola. I was waxing poetic to Brent yesterday about that. The viola in that package is absurd. I love what you're saying about that, because it's about relationship building, but I also think that there are sounds that you can get from digital instruments that don't exist in the real world. So I think that's the only place where the cost and familiarity and all those things aside, I think you can get like you're saying, a real uniqueness or a real otherworldly thing from creating an instrument or shaping an instrument digitally that doesn't actually exist in the real world. But I do think that, the playability of a digital instrument has done a lot to bridge the gap. And so I've always thought of composing as playing the largest musical instrument you can, which is an orchestra. Like, I think of a conductor as the person who plays an orchestra, as if the orchestra is their musical instrument. But that doesn't mean that you need to be able to read alto clef and switch from viola to cello and stuff like that, right? I think there's pros and cons to both of them.
Well, I obviously, so do I. I think that, all the modern technology that we have, we can do manipulations on sounds that were, even 5 years ago, we couldn't do. And there's such a rich palette of samples out there. But, from my perspective, I can toil for hours and hours and hours on an orchestral cue and make it sound as close to real as possible. And then if I'm fortunate to actually have it performed by an orchestra, within 5 seconds of being in front of the real orchestra, I go, yeah, that's what it's supposed to sound like.
And you can check yourself as well, right? Like they know their job better than we do.
I would much rather have 60, well, I mean, if you got that kind of a budget, 60 other musicians playing my music and putting their emotion and humanity and, their 10,000 hours of skill plus on my music than anything. I mean, that's, anyway, I've said enough. In the gaming world, I know the gaming world has had huge orchestral scores. Is that changing now? Is it more high? It's certainly hybrid, isn't it, these days?
Yeah, like working right now with Ramin Djawadi. So, we have large budgets and we record at Sony Pictures with the LA Players, which I think are the best in the world. Sorry, Hal. They're good though, and
Don't get me started.
yeah, and so we're talking like $1 million budgets. So with games, that's the sky's the limit. Now, really, it's just on par with film, and then you can always, some games go right down to, licensed score or just composers working on desktop scores for $10,000 budgets. So it really depends on what your game, budget is and the music needs and a lot of things. So yeah, but game music like 10 years ago definitely wasn't at that level where it is and definitely is now. And the scores are beloved and the players want to play on it and the composers want to sort of dip their toe in it too. So yeah, it's definitely gotten a lot bigger.
I'm told we go to questions now. Have we got any audience participation going on here?
Yeah, there's one up the top here running. Oh, that's good.
Your exercise, Rob.
Yeah.
A little exercise for you, Rob. Thanks so much for everything that you're sharing. Just a question about sound design and wondering if you're getting asked to do stuff that is now sort of crossing over into sound design. Are you building your own sample libraries that can sort of contribute to that?
Matt seemed ready to answer that.
Sure. It's a huge gray area, I would say, the differentiation between sound design and music. And it can get pretty confusing, especially with like a horror movie or something like that, where there's a lot of sound design, and sometimes someone gets a sickle to the head or something, and there's the sound effect, but they might also want to have something weird or otherworldly to that. And who does that? Does the composer do that? And I think having as many conversations as you can, obviously, with the filmmakers is really important, and liaisoning with whoever the sound designer is really important. I try and get, when I'm working on a score like that, try and get files back from the sound designer and have as much of an open conversation as possible. But sometimes you end up doubling up on something, and that's okay. They just have to, if you stem it out, then they can turn it down. But personally, I actually find the sound design element of composing really exciting and very fun. And, the multiple hours spent late at night toiling over creating just the right weird noise that works perfectly, and it's just one sound that you get to hold for 20 minutes, but works perfectly for whatever reason is enormously fun to me, and a big part of the job, actually, especially for more modern-based scores. And it's just something, a part of it that I absolutely love doing? Anyone?
You're so good at it.
There's a difference between the musical sound design and just straight up sound design, though, and that's something we want to let the audience know, that the straight up sound design, like if it's the sound of a sword that's
Right.
coming out, or a battle sound or something like that, is, I think, different than what we're doing as composers, as creating musical sound design. And so I leave that kind of sound design to the sound designers who can design all the actual noises that are happening in a game or something.
Do you have a way that you help delineate that?
Well, just when we have the list of assets that we're delivering, you
Okay.
know, I'm going to stay on the musical end of the assets that are being delivered, and then we'll have a sound designer work on just that. Then we have somebody comes in who directs for ADR. So I kind of separate it like that. And so the assets we're delivering that are just sound design assets are done by a sound designer that spends a lot of time getting the right sound, getting that exact sword sound that's going to turn people on, right? Or that right jumping sound. So anyway, I just separate it personally, the two things.
The gray area that I've run into is in ambience, where, you know, as a part of the score, building an ambient, you know, world, soundscape, and now the sound designers also created a soundscape. So that's the only time I've run into a major, not a problem, but, you know, and a clash is the wrong word too, but, you know, something that hopefully worked complementary, that then the dubbing mixer had to sort of weed his way through how to make that all work. And another question? Yeah.
Hi. How involved are you all in the mixing, depending on what kind of what you're doing? Like if you are working on an indie film or video games, and also two-part question: what are the standards for software, and what do you think of Logic stock sounds versus something like Native Instruments? And I'm just wondering what you think of that.
Do you mean the mix of the music, or the dub of the final film or game? The finishing mix.
I guess the mixing and the mastering, depending, like if you had to do all the mixing and the mastering for, say, an indie film, or does somebody else do that? Or what about the video game world?
I can talk in both worlds. So with games, like for the music mix, I'm there. So I'm at the desk with whoever it is. So in case of like some of the stuff we do, it's with Alan Meyerson and various mix engineers. But the game, and then the game, obviously, I help mix the game too. That's a bit more of an involved process because it's so big and it takes many days, and you're adjusting levels and compression and various side chaining and things off dialogue and stuff like that. So it's a lot more involved. So like I would say, as a composer, you definitely have a seat at the table in the mix of your material and your music. Mixing the film definitely depends on the producer. They may want you in the room or not. Most of them probably don't. But if you're not there, you may also lose your voice at the table. And in some cases, you might listen to your film after it's mixed and go, what the hell? My music's not even in that scene anymore. And I've seen that happen. So I think it just depends on, like, you know, how active you want to be in that, and whether your producer will let you too as well.
Well, the tradition in the film, television world is the composer usually attends what's called a playback at the dubbing studio, and that's where you listen to the film or the TV show from top to bottom, usually nonstop. And, you know, a composer can make notes about, you know, as Matt had said, you know, raising a cue, lowering a cue. Oh, gee, what happened to the cue here? Maybe we should sneak that in better. And, you know, so you're allowed to give feedback like that. But, you know, when I do it, I keep all my comments specifically tied to the music. You know, it's not really any of your business to go, oh, gee, that ADR line doesn't match very well. So that's the first thing. But part two of your question, we can get into quickly. I think my first comment is there are hundreds of thousands of libraries, or I don't know about 100,000, but certainly 50,000 sound libraries for music available. And even, you know, so you've got to explore all of them.
All of them.
well, as much as you can, on a need-to-know basis. This film that I'm doing right now, I needed handbells. Well, so I start looking at, and sure enough, Cinesamples had a handbell library, which thankfully was only $79. So I bought the handbell library, and it works nicely in the score. The stock sounds, even on some like Logic. I don't know Logic. I'm not a Logic guy, but I'm sure some of them are fine and usable, and other ones are probably crappy. The Ultimate one, the Ultimate Library, Native Instruments, I have that. I use elements from that when it's appropriate. So
I just did a huge upgrade of a couple of things, so I would love to say just one quick thing. There's like, I don't know what everyone's sort of knowledge level is, so I'll just give a sort of like little basis. You've got the software that you work in, which controls all your stuff and where you do the work, and then you have the instruments that you play through that. So the instruments that you play, any composing software is going to come with a bunch of instruments. Some of them are going to be really cool. Many of them are not going to be very cool at all. And so then you will have to go through the process that we all go through, which is, am I going to pay my electrical bill, or am I going to go to Big Fish Audio and live the dream? And living the dream sometimes feels very scary and very broke. But it's never been a better time to make digital content. So, for example, Spitfire has these incredible, like the Albion libraries, which are amazing, and then alternative strings, which is incredible. But they also have a sort of like little passion project, Brain Trust, which is completely free, and it's some of the most absurdly beautiful instruments called Labs. You just made your money back for anything you spent money on in this festival, just by the way. This shit should be so expensive, and it's free. And the software to run Spitfire library is free. It's stupid and wonderful, and I love it. And I want to buy them a cake. The most beautiful, perfectly sampled, very distinctive instrument library, soft piano, and there's a really interesting sort of like folk guitar, and there's wicked sort of suitcase organ and strings that you can use different articulations, huge amount of playability, massive ability for controlling vibrato and tremolo and that sort of thing, and they're free. So, I mean,
it's all out there. You just have to look for it. As far as the main software, I think all of us probably use some version of either Digital Performer, Logic, Cake, Cubase. Anybody else using anything other than those three?
Pro Tools.
And Pro Tools, yes.
Matt said something really awesome at the last post-alliance thing that we were at. He really did. It was wicked. In that, we were talking about the difference between Logic and Pro Tools. I'm very uncomfortable in Pro Tools, and you prefer to work in Pro Tools. But the reality is that that's just the tool, right? Like, your ideas are really what's important, and how well you know your instruments and stuff like that. So if you feel more comfortable and you write better in Logic, write in Logic. If you write better in Ableton, write in Ableton. It doesn't really matter. What you need is to have an extremely high quality product that mirrors the emotional needs, that satisfies the director, and that you can deliver a professional enough product at the end to the sound mixers so they don't send you like Ebola in an envelope because you're like, this delivery was a nightmare.
There are, however, some issues with some software, and that is, we are still in a visual medium, so the software you use has got to be able to haul picture or have picture running with the sequence. It needs to have some semblance of a time code interface because your picture will have a burn on it, and everybody speaks in terms of location in the picture with reference to time code numbers. So there are some fundamental filmic aspects of the sequencer programs you need to use. Any other questions? Do we have any more time?
We could do one more.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if any of you have any thoughts or are worried about AI-generated composition.
Is David Ramos in the house? Ramos! You have also waxed poetic about the AI stealing our jobs. We should tell Ramos to answer this question. Sorry, I was just checking to see if you're here. I'm not actually answering questions.
I like in games, like generative music, like this sort of niche-y, but I've seen it done like games like Bloom. There's a few games that have had AI generative music in it. It's pretty cool. I think it's kind of niche-y, but there's algorithmic stuff that could drive that. Like if you're a Max MSP person or someone who uses like you know, is just code-based music generators. Like you could do it. It's super nichey, but I don't really know what to say.
If somebody is
algorithmic stuff,
controlling
you have
the
to put it in.
algorithm
Yeah,
of... Sorry.
exactly. Well, you as a human, you have to, as a programmer, make the algorithms that play the AI-generated music anyway. So I guess there's some art to that.
Well, and it takes a compositional skill or understanding to be able to build those algorithms.
Yeah.
So, and then, well...
Pretty
No,
heady. Pretty
it's not,
heady.
you know something, you still gotta, what
The
is the
robots are
medium
coming.
we work in? It's emotion and drama, and so it's still gonna take a human being to think musically about what's needed. What do you think?
Yeah, I was saying the robots are coming, but once the robots write the music, someone's going to have to decide. I can't think about the robots. I'm just going to keep doing what I do. If the robots take me over, that's so be it.
Another view of the AI is we've all dealt with loop libraries where, Red sort of pulled the curtain back. You know, you can press a button of one of the keys on the keyboard if you're depending on the program you're using, and now there can be a 4-piece rock band playing a loop. And if it's a good library, you've got each element of that rock band can be split out onto different keys. So now you can arrange this 4-8-bar pattern that somebody else has written and modify it to fit your film. You've got tempo control, you've got arrangement control, all those. So you still have to make all these compositional decisions. It could be argued that that's some form of AI, but somebody has still had to write that and do that, and the composer who's now manipulating that loop to fit the product or the project, I should say, that we're scoring, it still takes a musical sensibility and skill, right?
I think that it levels the playing field on a budgetary perspective, which is probably actually damaging to the value of our industry, because evaluating, there was a really awesome point at the panel last night, which is, some kinds of musicians, many of us as musicians, work really hard to make sure that the value of what we're doing is quantified, that the budgets go down and it's harder and harder and harder to get those rates, largely because there are these digital ways of doing things. And so, the cost, you're not having to spend $250,000 to put an orchestra in a studio anymore to get an orchestral sound that is believable and meaningful. But what it does is it creates an opportunity for incredible content creators who might not have access to that $250,000 budget or access to the rooms where they can get to the table, as we were hearing in the earlier panel this morning, of they can't even get to the table to talk about what they would want to do should they be able to pitch for that project, much less get the project. But what it does, it lets you hear voices that you aren't hearing, right? So if some 14-year-old kid wants to go, like when I'm on tour with a couple of bands that I play with, we make garage band loops in the van and we create really awesome music using the drummer tracks on Logic, or like if somebody's got a laptop, the Logic drummer function is now like a real live playing drummer that you can it feels like you're playing with a drummer. It's still digital and there's still problems with it, but it's more realistic than it's ever been. And so for those of us who want to make big, meaningful music with people in a room, it takes some of the buying power away. But in terms of being able to hear from voices that were not able to be heard before, I think it's kind of cool. I mean, I hope it doesn't take my job, but also maybe the robot uprising is going to be really fun. I don't know. They better bring the chip. Like, I want the chip so that I can just be like, today I'm going to learn to play viola in 15 minutes. That's what I want. Give me the chip. Only viola.
Wow,
Screw the cello. Viola for days.
You're exploding my brain.
Viola forever.
Yeah. Just before we break for lunch, Red, you're in the midst of some very talented men on this panel, and I
Very talented people.
Yeah, I would be people. Sure, I'd be remiss to not ask you the question of what you believe the future is for female composers. I know you don't want to say female composers, but I do just really quickly want a little bit of context to your quest to be the best, but also the future for helping women or bringing women to the forefront. If you could just really give me a couple of things for this audience, it would be great, and we'll wrap for lunch.
So glad that you asked me that question. Thank you. I'm never more than about a step and a half away from a soapbox. So I think a couple of things. I'm going to try to be as concise as I can with this giant subject matter. I would love to do a panel only on this, to be totally honest. There are a couple of things. One, the experience that I have had as a composer specifically, particularly in reference to, and I'm going to give a whole bunch of props here, Sarah Pavilionis is the fucking tits. She's so fucking cool. Pardon my language. I know, I cuss like a sailor. I have never had someone on my team like Ari and Sarah. All the people at SOCAN are incredible. And so being a female composer and being just part of this community of people, like I don't think of myself as different from anybody on this stage, given what's in my pants, right? I think we just all have a really awesome job that we get to do, and that's wicked. However, coming from being a musician, a performing musician, it's completely different interpersonally, and the work is so similar. It's all the same people. I have not been spoken down to by anybody in the SCGC, and that is a wildly different experience. I will totally cop to the fact that early on, when I was starting to establish myself and get to know people outside of my immediate group of colleagues, I overcompensated like a maniac. Because every room I go into, I'm ready for somebody to pull some crap, because in the music community, it always happens. There's never a room that I can go into that is safe for me to walk into, ever. There's always someone who's going to put me in a completely inappropriate, uncomfortable position. And then I have to do a thing that I refer to as shitty math, where I add all of the elements that I know are in that room after 37 years of being a human female in the world, and I divide that by the potential fiscal opportunity that I can get. And this is probably wildly unattractive, which is part of the math that I have to do, is the thing I'm going to say attractive to the people I'm talking to. I want to get that money. Full stop. So I have to understand all the layers of the dynamic I'm walking into. And so if I can establish myself as a unique voice using all the tools I have at my disposal, the bleeding heart, pinko liberal part of me is like, there is no reason for me, a Western white person, to be getting all these jobs. I have a tremendous amount of privilege. And the part of me that absolutely is a raging capitalist is going to take every fucking box I can. Every single one. I am not in competition with the people on this stage. I'm in competition with the director and the producer, and mostly just the producer. When it comes right down to it, I have never been more safe, more respected, more heard, more cared for, more backed up, and had more community. And I have a lump in my throat every time I think about it. Every time I go to a Vancouver Post Alliance hangout, every time I miss one, I'm like, fuck. Every time I get those emails, I get like 50 emails a day from the SCGC, the Screen Composers Guild of Canada. You guys do awesome work, and I'm so mad that I can't just teleport to Toronto, because I wanted to be at the Hans Zimmer thing so badly, and I couldn't do it, Adrian. Adrian Ellis is here. Anyone who is interested in composing, you need to talk to Adrian Ellis. He's amazing. The SCGC has made a fundamental difference in my life, in that it has shown me a place where I am actually just respected for my skill set. I swear to God, no one has called me a girl in months. I'm 37. Who do you call a girl? Anyone under the age of 16. Take that word out of your mouth. Like, not kidding. Take it out of your mouth. It's so disrespectful. I get it all the time in the gigging industry. I still get lectures from sound guys at this point in my career about what microphone I should be using. They lie to me about the mix in my monitor. I had somebody explain to me that maybe I had had too much to drink, because I caught them putting a pitch, like they had put pitch correction on, they put auto-tune on my microphone. I've been a singer for 30 years. I know how to sing in tune. Like, don't make those creative decisions for me. It's so patriarchal, and it's just so disrespectful. In the film composing community, nobody talks to me like I'm a little kid, and it blew my mind, and I wasn't expecting it. And so the difference between the industries is so clear to me. And so this is going to sound like a stupid soundbite, but yeah, I have rooms that I walk into and I go, that person in that room is powerful and important, and that person, I know, both from personal experience and from reports of people that I care about and respect, that person has assaulted more people than anyone knows. I know that person, And I know that person harms people, and I know that there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. So for those of us who are females working in this industry, we are working really, really, really hard to find ways within the legal structure that exists right now to call people to account for their actions. And if you have that little question mark in the back of your mind about some actions that you've taken where women are involved or vulnerable people are involved, you need to understand that we're going to come for you. You cannot hide anymore. And so when I go into those rooms and I see people that I know have harmed people in my industry, and some of the people in my industry have retired because they can't handle the PTSD every time they go into a room with their assaulter or somebody who raped their friend or whatever, and they just go, you know what, I don't care about music as much as I care about not feeling like this all the time, and they quit. And these are the meetings that we're going to in reference to Me Too. We're going to meetings and people are saying, I took a 20-year break from being an actor. I took a 20-year break. I moved across the fucking planet because I could not stand being in a room with this person over and over and over again. I have the same experience. They're in every room I go into. And so the shitty math that I have to do as well is deciding how much am I gonna lose? And how much is this opportunity worth to me? So when I go into a room, I remember, like, all the Me Too stuff is not anecdotal. This is not like a thing that we're hearing about in some far off place and isn't it sad for those people? It's us people. Every single human female that you know has that experience, full stop, probably multiple of them. So when we walk into that room and we go, this is a not safe environment for me to be in, and we go, can I just hang out with you or can I just like cling to you for a second? It's not because we're incapable, it's because we're working so hard to be in the room because we want to be there so badly. I want to be in that room so badly. I don't care if that jerk or those jerks who hurt me or hurt my friend, I don't care if they're in the room anymore. I'm not going to lose a single thing because I know that we haven't come far enough yet for Jean Ghomeshi to be convicted of a crime that he provided evidence for himself. I know that we are no longer in a world where people can hide, but we're still in the ugly middle child zone where they can't hide, but we can't do anything about it either. So how much am I willing to lose to say this person did X, Y, Z? Early on in my life, I might have been willing to lose a few opportunities, but then I did. And it took me a long time to rebuild. And so now that I've rebuilt, I'm not gonna lose a single thing. I'm gonna drain every single opportunity from every single room I can, regardless of what piece of shit is in it. And so in the film community, these people just treat me like a person, and that is revolutionary. I cannot overstate. It is revolutionary to be treated like a person and to simply talk about work. I'm excited for a time when that's all we talk about because the shit isn't happening anymore. But in the interim, I'm pretty tired of women sitting around in rooms going, how are we gonna figure this out? Like, if you walk in those, pride parades, or you put on that pink shirt for Anti-Bullying Day, or you put that pin on your lapel, or you call yourself a feminist, you better walk your talk, because if I catch you faking it, I'm gonna tell you to take that word out of your mouth and go and do some work. Like, we need you really badly. We've never needed you more. So if you're counting yourself as a sort of feminist ally and making sure that there's space for women in the community and you're giving yourself a big pat on the back because you remembered a hashtag, you gotta show up, or you gotta stop saying that shit. Like, work or shut up about it. And that's all I have to say about that. And also Spitfire forever.
Yeah, I got no words. Thanks for sharing, really, truly. You also did a job for me in specifically singling out our representatives from SOCAN and the SCGC that not only supported this financially, but are here supporting you guys. So make sure you go talk to people in those organizations, and we really appreciate their support. Let's give all these guys a round of applause. Thank you, Hal, for leading this. And
you're welcome. Thank you.